Hello, I'm Austin Baker of Baker's Dozens Productions, and welcome back to another episode of Exploring Experiences. On today's episode, we are going to dive into another one of the 10 secrets of experience design, as I like to call them here at my company. And today's secret is going to be audience centered. How do you make an experience that is tailored to your audience? And what are some of the maybe consequences of taking that too far or not going far enough? We're going to explore all that today. Now, before we begin, just for those of you watching on YouTube, it's kind of funny because when you first start seeing yourself on video, and you do all these hours of editing and you're staring at this screen, you start to notice things about your space that maybe you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And so you'll see in the background here, in the last video, the Disney patent drawings were just kind of free floating. I really did not like the way that looked in the last video, so I went out and bought frames and framed them all. So that makes the space look a little bit tidier and more professional. So I have to say, thank you for pointing that out to me. But without further ado, I want to jump into this episode. Now, I will argue the concept of audience-centered design is one that is very, very important, but it's also very controversial for reasons that we will get into a little bit later in this episode. But the big thing that you need to remember is this quote from the late, great Walt Disney, who else, that basically says, you don't build it for yourself. You know what the people want, and then you build it for them. Now, I have seen this so many times in different creative projects that I've done, whether that be some of the writing I've done, some of the events that I've planned, some of the museum exhibit style experiences that I have created. A lot of the ones that fail are because they don't take into account what their audience wants. A lot of times you will see a creative project where it's literally the pet project of whoever is in charge, and no regard for how people are going to respond to it, whether they want it or not, whether they're going to care about it. And then they just full steam ahead, my way or the highway, this is the way it's going to work. And then they are surprised when, well, it doesn't work out, or if it's not financially successful, or if it gets bad feedback, or if people don't show up, right? That is because they are not designing it in an audience-centered way. You have to, especially in a field like experience design, or in the museum world, or in the live events industry, or the theme park industry, zoos, aquariums, any of that. Anything where you are dealing with live guests, you need to take their needs and their wants and what they would find interesting into account as the very, very first step of the design process. So if you have taken any courses in experience design, instructional design, industrial design, even a lot of times like engineering courses, you're probably familiar with the design thinking cycle. And if you're not, I can put a little graphic here on the YouTube video. I could put a little link in the description. It's something that if you are designing anything, you need to be familiar with. But we won't go into the entire cycle, but I do want to point out that the very first step of the design thinking cycle is empathize, right? You need to understand who your audience is, what they want, what they need, what they struggle with, what's going to make their life easier, what's going to be a topic of interest to them. And if it's not a topic of interest to them, how could you design it in a way to make it interesting? So you always have to start with empathizing. So this then brings me to that first point of controversy in terms of creating something that is audience centered. Because a lot of times audiences maybe don't know what they want, right? And there's that argument, if you only give people what they want, then you're never going to have anything new. Never going to have anything avant-garde. You're never going to have anything that's created for the sake of existing, right? And that is where I want to make a huge distinction here between art and design. I feel like a lot of times people just lump them together and say, oh, they're the same thing. I will say that in my mind, they are not. Art, in my opinion, is created by an individual or a group of artists, a collective, and it's meant to make a sort of personal statement, right? Maybe about a certain political topic, maybe about a certain social issue, maybe about a historical event or person or something of that nature, right? Whereas design should be more about how something functions, how efficient it is, how it appeals to different demographics, right? So at the end of the day, I always like to say, if you want to know the difference between art and design, ask, who is this created for? If it's created for you yourself or yourself and a group of like-minded people, then it's probably art, right? Whereas if it is created specifically for a certain demographic or for mass appeal, then and for lack of a better word, to get your message out there to as many people as possible, to capture as many demographics as you possibly can, to make everyone happy, to make a bunch of money, you're probably dealing with design. So I want to kind of talk about the difference between those two before we get any further into the episode, because I'm not saying art is bad, right? No. You absolutely need art. Art is what keeps us, what keeps us human. And like I was saying before, a lot of times audiences don't know what they want, right? Or they don't know they want something until they see it. So, my wife and I were just watching this movie over the weekend called The Substance, right? Really, really weird, crazy movie, kind of body horror film. That's definitely one where I'm like, yeah, nobody asked for this, right? But it was still good. So you do need art, and you need this sort of creative expression for the sake of creative expression. But you gotta understand the difference when you are going into the development of a creative project. So if you want some shorthand as to some examples of what constitutes art versus design, best example I can think of is the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the movies created for that series versus something that is created for A24, right? So they're both film studios. They both have had, pretty major success, right? Over the last probably decade or so. I'm not exactly sure when A24 started making movies, but it feels like they've been around a while now. Obviously, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been around since 2009, right? Or 2008, I don't remember, but it's been around a while. Both successful. One, I would argue, is art versus design, right? The Marvel Cinematic Universe, the movies are very, very much crowd pleasers, right? They know what audiences are going to want. They try to sneak in little cameos and references to the comic books and little nuggets that'll set up storylines later down the line, right? And especially the first movie in any series, right? So you watch the first Iron Man, the first Thor, Black Panther, the first Captain America, right? They Shang-Chi actually did this too. They all kind of followed the same pattern, right? You're introduced to this character, they either get a superpower or they get sucked into some fantasy world that they're not familiar with. They become a hero, and then I think in literally every single one of those movies, they end up fighting a villain who is basically them but evil, right? The exact same power set, or maybe a twisted version of their moral philosophies or things like that. And so, yeah, you kind of go into a Marvel movie expecting expecting certain story beats, expecting a certain type of tone, right? It is very audience centered. Then you've got stuff like A24 that is doing, good lord, they do everything now. I know back when they first were getting started, it was mostly just horror. I know they've expanded to doing drama and comedy, and things like that. But you look at things like Hereditary and Midsummer and The Substance and The Green Knight and Pearl and X and I'm trying to think of other movies. There was that one with Nicolas Cage, the Dream Scenario, I think is what it's called, right? All very, very different movies, all very sort of bizarre art house films. They're hit and miss, right? Some of them are sort of iconic classics nowadays. Other ones you're kind of like, that didn't really work, right? Those are art, I would say. That is the director, swinging for the fences and taking a bunch of risks and understanding that it's not going to appeal to everybody, and that's okay, right? So whereas with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they want to have that mass appeal and get as many butts in the seats as possible, as opposed to making a statement or doing things the way the director wanted. In fact, Marvel actually has this infamous reputation for not wanting directors who want to do their own thing. They want directors on their movies who are easy to sort of control and stay within their style guidelines, essentially. Outside of the movie industry, think of something like a Kojima video game versus Call of Duty or Battlefield, right? Call of Duty and Battlefield are this sort of almost like popcorn video game, sort of first person shooter that is just kind of fun. Maybe, it has a plot. They have like story modes that some which are pretty good, I will not lie, but they're pretty basic and generic, right? It's more about the multiplayer. It's more about connecting people. It's more about upgrading your weapons and stuff like that and having that sort of mass appeal. Whereas a Kojima game, so think of like Death Stranding, right? Death Stranding was another one of those where it's just like, what am I playing here, right? And because of that, there were a lot of people that didn't like it. It wasn't really that sort of smashing commercial success that something like Call of Duty was. However, if you look at it purely from an artistic standpoint, yeah, it worked really well. Another Kojima game, I'm a huge fan of the Metal Gear Solid games, right? Those are all very, very strange, sort of artsy fartsy sort of experiences. I know people joke that like, oh, you play a Metal Gear Solid game and basically there's an hour of dialogue for every or cutscenes, an hour of cutscenes for every 15 minutes of gameplay. But you know what? That's an artistic choice and it really works. Or another example could be something like a museum versus a immersive art installation like Meow Wolf, right? A museum is going to try to deliver its message and its educational content to as many people as it possibly can. And so it's got to be a little bit more layered and audience centered and appealing to demographics of different ages and education levels and genders and races and things of that nature. Whereas something like Meow Wolf, it's kind of like, okay, we thought this sounded cool, we thought this looked cool, so we made it. Hopefully you enjoy it. So yeah, with art, as opposed to design, you are basically just saying, here's something I created, I'm proud of it, I'm going to throw it out there for anyone to enjoy as well. Hopefully you do, and hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. And I love that, right? I think you need a healthy dose of both in the creative industries. I do not prefer one over the other. I will say, though, that when you are creating something that's a little more artistic or you are creating art as opposed to a design, you sometimes have your message misconstrued, right? So one of the most famous examples is Fight Club, right? Fight Club was a novel that was written by a gay man, basically skewering toxic masculinity, right? Oh, let's all get together in these secret underground, get-togethers where we beat the crap out of each other, and that's the epitome of manliness, right? That was his original message. And then, of course, they made the film out of it with Brad Pitt and Ed Norton that was super popular. And a lot of people misunderstood the message, right? You actually had people who were like, oh, this is so cool. Tyler Durden is such a, great character that I want to, emulate, right? Same thing kind of happened with American Psycho or the Joker movie, which is kind of funny because the director of the Joker movie hated the way that people were misconstruing his message in the first film so much that he basically used the sequel as a vehicle to critique those people. And the sequel ended up being a crashing disaster, and it, satisfied nobody, and it was a huge flop, right? But he was so annoyed, and he felt so strongly about how badly people were misunderstanding his original movie that he wanted to set the record straight, right? So that is the danger of doing art as opposed to design, which in design, and especially audience-centered design, you kind of already know what the audience should be getting out of it, and you're trying to sort of nudge them and guide them in that direction. Another really impactful thing that happens when you create something that is audience-centered, that it is designed to be for a specific demographic, you can create this phenomena, which I think I talked about a little bit in my storytelling podcast episode. But if done correctly, the audience will relate to the main character enough that they sort of self-insert into that character. Or if in the case of like a museum or an escape room, if it is tailored to their needs and their wants well enough, they are going to feel like the protagonist in the story. And so what does that look like? So you go to a museum. One of the best examples of this would be at like the Titanic Museum, where you go and they give you an actual character. Well, not a character. In this case, it's a real person that you are supposed to look at, and it was a real person that was on the voyage of the Titanic, the one that obviously sank. And you go through the whole experience with this sort of perspective of, oh, okay, my person was a lower class citizen. So when you get to the lower class bunks, you can stop and think, oh, okay, this is what Joe Smith would have actually experienced, right? When you read about the horrific ways that especially the lower class on the Titanic were basically abandoned, right? You can kind of sympathize more with the plight of those people. So that's what I'm talking about. You make the audience member feel like the main character in the story. Obviously, video games do this really, really well. That's why they're so popular, right? Especially story-based video games where you have this sort of faceless protagonist, or on the flip side, in something like Skyrim or Fallout or Cyberpunk, right? You can actually customize your character to, well, you could make them look exactly like you if that's the way you want to go, or you could make them look like somebody that you feel like looks badass, right? Or looks cool, or what you would want to look like if you lived in this sort of fantasy world or dystopian future or retro futuristic apocalypse, right? Those are experiences that are audience centered. And much like I was saying before, a well-designed experience, one that is layered, which is an episode down the line, right? A layered experience will be able to create that feeling for many different demographics. Again, no matter your age or your race or your economic background, your political leanings, right? A well-designed, audience-centered experience will understand all of those different demographics and give them a way to kind of feel like the protagonist in this story. You see this with like marketing campaigns, particularly experiential marketing campaigns, right? That feature interaction, whether that is via the web or via a live brand activation, right? It's not just sit back and watch us use this product or watch someone else talk about this product. It's no. You need to get involved here, right? You are the one who is going to have your life changed by purchasing our services or buying this particular product or incorporating our brand into your life. Obviously, you also have in the museum world some of the most effective ways to bring the audience into the story like that is by simply using the words you, right? Imagine that you were a survivor on the Titanic. Imagine if you were fighting in the Civil War. Imagine if you were on the beaches of Normandy, right? You're going to have different ways of connecting to those different demographics, those different audiences. But that is why it is so important that you understand your demographic so that you can create this sort of tailored experience or micro experience, if you want to go on a smaller scale, that is going to form that connection with them and get them to where you want them to be, whether that is purchasing your product, whether that is learning about a specific historical or scientific topic, right? Make the guest the protagonist, and the best way to immerse them in the story is by understanding them and tailoring bits of the experience to them. Now, I will also say that there is some danger in going too audience-centered, going too far into that audience-centered design as opposed to artistic vision or creative vision, right? And that is things get repetitive and stale. I mentioned that the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies and TV shows are a perfect example of when you prioritize audience-centered design over artistic vision. And yeah, you're seeing that now. So it's been going on for what, since 2008 or 9. So it's been going on for quite a while. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is finally starting to struggle a little bit, right? Because people feel like they have seen the same story over and over and over again, right? There are not that many major twists and turns, and if they are, it's usually some sort of nostalgia bait to basically get butts in seats, like Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, don't get me wrong, as a lifelong Spider-Man fan, I absolutely loved that movie, but it was pure fan service, excuse me. As opposed to, okay, what is the best story we can tell about Peter Parker and him and his journey as Spider-Man, right? So it can get stale. Maybe it feels a little repetitive. And there's also this problem that I am noticing in a lot of media nowadays. So whether that is the TV industry, the video game industry, the movie industry, I even see it personally in the event and museum industry. But when your audience has a certain expectation that has been, repeatedly fed to them over and over and over again, if you try to break the mold, it's like giving a toddler a piece of broccoli, right? They're gonna be like, what the heck is this? I don't like this. I am a diehard Star Wars fan, so if any other Star Wars fans are listening, you're either gonna really love me for what I'm about to say or really hate me for what I'm about to say. But I absolutely love the Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi, right? And it is the most probably controversial of the newer films because it breaks the mold, right? it's not, as opposed to episode 7 and episode 9, which I still enjoy, but they're very paint by the numbers sort of crowd pleasing films that you kind of know where the story is going already, right? You watch them and you say, oh, okay, I feel like, this is a callback to Return of the Jedi. Oh, look, it's it's a callback to Revenge of the Sith, right? Whereas I felt like episode 8, Last Jedi, was actually new and trying something in a different direction and actually had this sort of artistic vision. I personally love it. I know other Star Wars fans that love it. A huge, huge, huge majority absolutely despised it. And I hope that changes over the years and they can appreciate it more for its artistic vision. But yeah, it tried to break the mold. And because everything we had seen so far up to episode 8, so episode 7, some of the TV shows, I guess there were some TV shows going on at the time. Some of the TV shows, the video games, the new books and comic books, they were all, not to say they were bad, but they were all very crowd pleasing. And I've seen this happen too it's not just, media, it's the museum world, it's the events industry, the festival scene, particular concerts, right? If you have gone to a particular artist, seen a particular artist in concert many, many different times, right? You kind of get a sense of, okay, this is what they're going to be playing, and maybe in this order. And, for the encore, they are going to do XYZ, right? And I've seen this happen with my parents. They are diehard fans of the rock band Styx, which, if you're not familiar with them, they're a really good band, so you should become familiar with them. But they have been to so many concerts. And I remember one time after they went to a concert, they came back and were complaining about, they were playing a bunch of music from their new album that I didn't really know and didn't really like. And that is an exact example of what happens if you are too audience centered for too long, if you don't change things up, if you are only focused on pleasing the crowd. Okay, well then when you try something new, like playing new songs or promoting your new album or playing songs out of order, your diehards, the people that have been following you and who are used to these experiences, the experience going a certain way, are going to be like, oh, okay, I don't like that, right? You see that in the theme park industry as well. When Disney rolled out their, what is it called? I think they may have actually changed it again. Is it the Lightning Lane, right? Basically replaced the Fast Pass system, and you can pay for extra Fast Passes and stuff. That was a huge deal because so many people had been so used to the traditional Fast Pass system, which I would argue was pretty audience centered. The last time I went, which granted that was 2018, so it's been a while, but the last time my wife and I went to Disney World, you got 3 free Fast Passes with your admission ticket, right? I don't think that's something they do anymore. I think you actually have to pay for the Lightning Lane, which obviously that upset a lot of people because before it was almost like a complimentary service, and now it is additional on top of your admission price. And so, yeah, if you want to really be audience centered, you really got to be prepared for backlash if you suddenly pivot or change something important or decide to charge for something that used to be free before, or do something that's a little more avant-garde with your story. So that's not to say you can't do it and can't do it successfully, but just be aware there is going to be pushback and be prepared to deal with that pushback. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but the best way to get ahead of something like that, if you know that your institution or your company is going to be implementing changes that kind of break the mold or might be, different from what the audience expects. The best way to get ahead of that is to know your audience and know how they are going to respond. So one thing that I have seen happen is, okay, maybe we are creating this more experimental video game, right? Or this you see this in the comic book world all the time, right? Because you have like a million stories going at the same time of the same characters. I'm a huge Superman fan at the moment, and so one of the ones that I am reading is Absolute Superman, that is still an ongoing series, but it basically is this sort of experimental what if, what if Superman's life went different, and what if he, wasn't adopted, and how would his personality be if, he was a teenager when Krypton exploded as opposed to a toddler, right? And it's a great story. However, there's still like 4 or 5 other ongoing Superman titles that are more of the traditional story that everyone knows and loves, right? So you see that happen, especially in the television world, in the video game world, in the comic book sphere, a lot of times in the event industry as well, right? It's like, okay, we will create something that is a little more mold breaking, but then we're also going to continue doing the more traditional thing to keep our regular audience happy, right? And so first things first, you got to understand who is your target audience when you are creating a new experience or a new piece of media or a new product, right? Are you going for the sort of broad general population? I will tell you right now, don't do that. That is the quickest way to fail, is by saying we want to attract everybody, right? Know who is going to enjoy your product and tailor it towards them. So that, that could be the super fans, right? So the people who like just are absolutely obsessed with your brand, with the story you're telling, with your museum, with the events you put on, right? Your Swifties, right? Those are going to be your Swifties. The people who will basically consume and follow and enjoy anything, in that case, Taylor Swift puts out, right? That sort of experience is going to look very different than the experiences that you create for your more casual fan, right? Oh, somebody who, we'll stick with the Taylor Swift example. Oh, somebody who's, hears Taylor Swift on the radio and, has watched some of her videos, of her like speaking and her concerts on YouTube, and, sees her at the Kansas City Chiefs games, right? They are going to be a little bit more intimidated by an event that is tailored to the super fan, right? So you got to understand, there will be things that a casual fan may not understand, and you may need to teach them. Or there might be things that maybe they need a little bit more prodding before they get comfortable with, right? And even then, so even irregardless of fandom and familiarity, you've also got stuff like age demographics, right? So theme parks do this really, really well too, where they usually will have, you have your kiddie rides, right? You have your kiddie land with its bumper cars and its tilt-a-whirls and its less intense rides. But then you've also got your thrill rides for sort of the teenagers and adults who are more thrill seekers. And then you also have the shows, the more slow rides, the dark rides, the stage performances for the older demographic who maybe aren't going to enjoy those sort of hardcore thrills, right? You need to understand who is going to be interacting with your experience and your product, and make sure you tailor the experience towards each of those different demographics so that they can have a good time. Now, even though I don't recommend just kind of casting out the broad net and seeing who you catch, if you want to go for a larger, more broad demographic, best way to do that is through the use of emotions, right? Trying to get someone to feel excited about your product, trying to get them to feel sad or angry about a certain crisis that's going on, trying to get them to feel sympathetic or empathetic towards the subject of your educational lecture, right? So if you go that direction, the reason that works so well is because obviously emotions are one of those universal human experiences. So there's this great book that I used to use when I was a teacher. It's called Culture Sensitive Design. I think you can get it for like $5 to $7 on Amazon now. I would highly recommend it if you are doing anything within the design field. But there is a graph in this book. Let me see if I can find it here for a second. Let me put the mic down. But there is essentially a graph that explains how you, there it is, how you can design for different audiences based on, they call it the 3 lenses to which to view people on 3 different levels of design. So at the very top, you have personal, right? You are designing a product or an experience for a very, very specific person, right? That is probably your more customizable experiences. Then you've got cultural / group. So this is kind of what I've been talking about. You are creating an experience for men who live in California between the ages of 18 and 30, right? Okay, that's going to look very different than if you were trying to create a experience for a group of Southern women 40 to 65, right? And you could break it down in many different ways, right? You could break that down by geographical location, by religion, by political affiliation, whatever. But then you've got the most broad, which is universal design, or design focused on human nature, right? And that's what I'm talking about when I am talking about using emotions to capture a broad audience. Doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, where you came from, what religion you are, what what age you are. You've probably felt sad at some point. You've probably felt happy. You've probably felt anger. You probably felt disgust, right? That is a universal part of the human experience. So if you want to cast that net broadly, which again, I don't recommend long term, but go for emotion. The only problem with utilizing a emotion and an experience is that logic gets checked out the door, right? When you design using emotions and trying to make that emotional appeal to your audience, logic and reason just don't work, right? People are not going to listen to a logical argument as to why your product is great or why they should care about this particular historical figure or implementing this particular policy into the state government if they are so angry they can't think, right? And without getting too political, obviously, there is a lot of that going on in modern day politics, not just here in the US, but around the world, right? Appeal to that emotion and don't worry about if your argument makes sense, right? So that's one danger of trying to go broad and making that emotional appeal. So another thing you got to keep in mind, especially if you are trying to appeal to the needs and emotions and wants of a particular audience, is, are you motivating them or are you manipulating them? So there's this great book called Khrushchev's Shoe and Other Ways to Engage an Audience of 1 to 1,000, written by Roy Underhill. You may be familiar with him if you grew up in the 90s or the aughts. He had a show on PBS that was about woodworking. But he also wrote this book about engaging audiences. And one of the core concepts of that is you have to decide and you have to view this through sort of an ethical lens. Do you want to manipulate your audience or do you want to motivate them? So what's the difference, right? Kind of my shorthand is if you are motivating your audience, you are trying to coach them and encourage them to be the best that they can be and to achieve their goals. If you are trying to manipulate them, well, then you are trying to get them to do something that they really don't want to do. Usually that betters yourself or your bottom line or your brand or something of that nature, right? There's the hilarious South Park episode where I think it was Whole Foods, where they're trying to manipulate Randy into donating to starving kids in another country, right? And it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna put up we're gonna put up a picture of a real child who is not getting your donation, and then I think there's a scene where they have to where you have to when you press no, you don't want to donate, you have to stare into the eyes of one of those kids as you hit the no button, right? That's manipulation. Whereas motivation is more like you're hyping your audience up, you're pumping them up, you're saying you believe in them, you are encouraging them as opposed to making them feel bad or making them feel guilty and, or even psychologically manipulating them, right? There are, I've studied marketing pretty extensively, and there are so many manipulative tactics that marketers use to make their products look a lot better than it really is, right? So, again, the ethicality of that is a topic for another day, but you got to understand the difference between manipulation and motivation and decide what are you really trying to do with your audience. So both motivation and manipulation can be used to get your audience to do what you want them to do, whether that is attend your event, buy your product, watch your movies, whatever, right? But the thing is, only one of them is going to maintain trust. If your audience finds out that you are manipulating them, they're not going to be happy and they are going to completely lose their trust in you as a organization or as a brand. Okay. So, trust is one of the key cornerstones, I would even argue, of being an audience-centered organization or designing an audience-centered experience. Some examples. So if your audience doesn't trust you, they are going to be hyper fixated on all of your flaws and may even exaggerate them. Great example of this would be when a quote unquote Disney adult goes to Universal Studios, right? They don't, believe that Universal brings the same magic or has the same high quality designers. And so, they're going to be like, well, Disney would do that better. Oh, look at that. They just have their trash sort of on display. Oh, that employee was kind of rude to me. You'd never get that at Disney, right? Another example would be when a restaurant reopens after being closed down by the health department, right? Doesn't matter how many times you have been there, no matter how much you loved that brand before, you're going to be a little skeptical every time you go there, and you're going to be really paying attention for any little bit of dust or anything that is on your food, or if your food tastes a little funky, right? This will remain nameless just because I don't want to drag brands on this podcast and, potentially get a lawsuit or anything. But several years ago, my wife and I decided to go to it was a chain, right? So local in the sense that it was here in Indianapolis, but it was a chain restaurant that served breakfast food. I'll leave it at that. Okay. And as we were sitting there, we sat down in a booth right next to a wall, and we're sitting there. All of a sudden, I see something move out of the corner of my eye. Next thing I know, my wife looks over and goes, "Oh my God, Austin, that's a roach." And sure enough, there was a cockroach climbing the wall, and then it climbed down and went under the syrup containers. Um, we got the server immediately, told them what was going on, said that we needed to move tables. For some reason, we didn't leave the restaurant. I guess we were super hungry, but we went to a different table and, got our food, ate it quickly, and then got out of there. And to this day, almost 10 years later, we have never returned to that restaurant, that specific restaurant. And anytime I go to any other location of this chain, I inspect everything. I, check the walls. I check under the syrup container before I sit down. I'm always kind of hyper alert, right? Because me as a consumer, I lost my trust with that brand. I lost my faith in that brand, right? Another thing, and this is a little bit on the darker side. Several years ago, the Greenwood Park Mall was just right down the street from our old house. There was an incident there where a guy came in and he had a gun and he killed some people, right? It was a horrific event. It made the national news. Really tragic. A really, really tragic experience for this community. One that we're still not over, I would argue. But ever since then, every time I've only been there a handful of times, every time I go into the Greenwood Park Mall, I am hypervigilant, right? I lost trust and faith in that company's ability to keep their guests safe in this case. And so it's like, I'm kind of on edge. I'm looking around. I try not to linger. Like, I go to the store I need to go to, get my stuff and then book it back to the car, right? I lost my trust with that particular organization, institution. It doesn't always have to be that dark, right? It could be as simple as, if you are a student going to a rival school, right? Visiting a friend or a family member who decided to go to college at your college's rival, right? You don't trust that place. You don't like them. So you are going to point out and find every single little flaw in the experience on the campus with the classes, right? That you can find. So trust is essential for having an audience-centered experience. So build trust, maintain trust, go to great lengths to keep your audience's trust with your experience. So another sort of kind of life hack, for lack of better words, that you can do in terms of making sure your experience is audience-centered is once you figure out what demographic you're going for, figure out where they are going to be and go to them, right? So perfect example of this would be like a conference, okay? If you go to a biology conference and want to present your product there at the exhibitors hall, okay, you can kind of count on the fact that most of the people in attendance are going to have a basic grasp on the fundamentals of biology, right? Whereas if you were just doing a commercial that aired during a football game, or if you were doing a demo at the local science fair or something like that, you cannot expect your audience to have the same understanding that a bunch of biologists who would be attending a biology science conference would have, right? Ditto if you go to like a history conference, right? Or if you go to a teacher's conference, you already know that the audience that's in attendance is going to have a background in the content you want them to understand. Another thing that you see, which unfortunately it feels like there's not much of a difference nowadays, political rallies and sporting events, right? where, okay, you already know where the majority of that audience stands in terms of, a political issue, or, what team they are going to be rooting for, right? And so that makes it way easier to tailor your experience to that audience and get the right eyes on it. Another thing you can do to try to reach out to your desired audience, right, with your experience or your product, is to partner with somebody who already has their ear, right? Whether that is an influencer or another brand. Brand collaborations are huge right now. So like McDonald's has been doing all these different collaborations with musical artists, right? Where they have the Cardi B meal, right? Like, what would Cardi B order when she went to McDonald's? And you could get that too, right? They had the Kerwin Frost McNugget Buddies, the adult Happy Meal, right? For a while there, where they partnered with this artist who I was not familiar with until they did this promotion. And now I at least know who he is, right? I collected all of the little toys, which that we can get into that later. We'll get into brand IPs and their power in a different episode, but I digress, right? You've also got all of these tie-in promotions. Like currently, I keep seeing this ad for Call of Duty and Squid Game, right? So you are exposing people who play Call of Duty to this Netflix show that they may or may not already be familiar with, right? That the creators of Squid Game and the Netflix marketing department identified as, oh, we think this demographic would enjoy this show, right? When the Simpsons movie came out back in the late aughts, they partnered with 7-Eleven and transformed a bunch of the 7-Elevens into live experiences that were meant to resemble the Quickie Mart, so the fictional convenience store from the Simpsons universe. Fortnite does this all the time, right? Where it'll be like, oh, there's a new Star Wars movie coming out, so you can play as the Star Wars characters now. Oh, there is, a new God of War game, so now you can play as Kratos. I think what Travis Scott did, like a live virtual concert that was exclusive to Fortnite players, right? So you can find your audience. You can kind of literally target your audience by finding a brand or an influencer that already has their ear. Now, there are some dangers with this, right? Because if you have a misstep and crash and burn, you're going to be ridiculed forever. I know in the gaming community, people still laugh at the fact that you can drive a Mercedes-Benz in Mario Kart, right? Nobody likes playing as those, likes playing with the Mercedes-Benz cars in Mario Kart. And it's kind of a in-joke at this point with diehard fans of like, that didn't work. And so that brand is sort of tainted in the mind of Nintendo fans, right? There was another weird collaboration way back in the day where, like, in the comic book world, the Archie characters met the Punisher, right? I don't know what was going on there, but those are two drastically different audiences, and it did not work at all. When the Three Stooges movie, the modern movie that was not good at all. I'll just say that right off the bat, it was not very good. I think it was like the early 2010s that came out, but when they were promoting that, they had the actors playing Larry, Moe, and Curly go onto WWE in character and basically get beat up by a bunch of the wrestlers. And it was so weird and bizarre, and like the fans were not having it. They were booing the actors, and it was kind of like a PR disaster. And so, even worse, you run the risk of, by doing some of these collaborations, if you miss the mark, it could feel forced or inauthentic, and you could actually lose customers and fans, right? Where it's like, oh, they're really pushing this way too hard and, diluting the brand. Like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Right. Or one of the best examples that I can think of off the top of my head is like when you're watching a YouTube video and you get to the point where it's like, speaking of strange internet phenomena, here is this ad for a VPN, right? Or, oh, here's a random ad in the middle of our video for stamps.com or for not headbands, headphones, or some certain mobile game or something like that, right? It's funny because when you go to the YouTube videos and kind of do the little scroll bar thing and it shows you which parts of the video are the most replayed, almost without fail, it's always the part right after the advertisement, right? It actively annoys people to the point of I've seen people on the internet say, I go out of my way to avoid using those products because I am so frustrated that they keep popping up in my favorite YouTubers' videos, right? So you got to be really careful when you're doing those sorts of collaborations. On the flip side, if you really do want to try and gain new customers and a new audience, Roy Underhill in that book I was talking about says you need to go to the novices, right? Go to the people who maybe don't know anything about your brand or don't know anything about this particular historical or scientific topic, that don't know this particular, politician or political activist group, right? Because they are probably going to be a little bit more open to at least hearing you out at the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean you're always going to make a connection and they're always going to like you, but they're going to be at least a little bit more willing to listen, right? So that's why, you could, talk to like elementary school children, right? They're young and impressionable. Newbies to a company, new hires. In my strategic leadership and design master's program, we learned about the best way to change a company culture is by talking to the newbies and implementing that culture with them, because it's a lot harder to teach an old dog new tricks, basically. You could also choose a topic that is so niche that only, a handful of people are going to actually know anything about it. So perfect example of this is the Broadway play Hamilton. Okay. Before Hamilton came out, who knew the story of Alexander Hamilton, right? American historians, maybe, constitutional law students and lawyers, right? Maybe the people in the Treasury Department who have to print his face on money, right? But the general population, most of us didn't know the story of Alexander Hamilton. And so it was a great niche topic that could be expanded upon, and the audience didn't have any preconceived notions, right? You also see this happening in more of a sort of manipulative fashion with a lot of journalistic organizations, right? Where they will pick this topic that, is either new or people don't really know much about, and then sort of twist it and inject their own maybe agenda or opinion into it. And people don't know any better because they just have no exposure and no experience with that topic. Right? So on either end of the spectrum, you can reach the audience that you are trying to reach. So another thing that you need to practice if you want to have a experience that is more audience centered is this concept of what we call flexible focus. Now, this is something that is huge in the experience design field. And also it's gaining more traction in the business world. It is very prominent with the College of Extraordinary Experiences. It was identified as one of the 3 pillars, quote unquote, that hold up the entire foundation of the experience design field. And so what that essentially means is that you got to be flexible in a sense that you can jump back and forth between the big picture and the little details, and you need to be able to pivot at any point during the design process, right? There's a great quote that basically says, "The unbending tree breaks easily," right? If you do not practice flexible focus, you have already kind of doomed yourself from the beginning, right? Because you may, at any point in the process, it could be when you're doing market research and you find, oh, okay, maybe this original idea isn't going to hit as well as we hoped it would based on what we're hearing from, you know, pre-screenings and potential audience feedback at your like soft opening and stuff like that, right? That could hit during the actual event itself, right? Especially at a live performance. You might have something that goes over like a lead balloon, and if you just kind of stay the course and keep at it, you are going to upset your audience. You need to be able to pivot and be flexible and jump back and forth between really any elements of the design that might be working or might not be working without losing sight of the goal that you are trying to achieve at the end of the day. So as a former educator who taught both in the business side of experience design, but also on the not-for-profit side, so things like museums and cultural heritage, tourism, and things of that nature, I always like to emphasize flexible focus in terms of interpretive performance at like a museum or a national park or something. I am not sure if I've talked about this on the podcast before, but essentially an interpreter in the museum or cultural heritage sense are those employees that are at an experience, again, a living history site, right? And they may be in costume playing a first person character, and they are there to quote unquote interpret the content for you, the guest, right? When you do this, though, park rangers who are giving like an educational talk at, Yellowstone or Zion or whatever would fall under the same category. When you are doing interpretation, you have to practice flexible focus, right? Because, you're going to have some sort of educational goals that you are trying to get the audience to, but you need to be able to improvise and be quick on your feet. So like, for example, if you are doing a blacksmithing demonstration and one of the kids that shows up is really interested in learning about knife making, okay, sure, you could just kind of ignore his comment altogether or brush it off, right? And then just keep going with your sort of canned practice speech or, interpretation. That's not going to make for a good experience, right? That's not going to make for an audience-centered experience. A good interpreter, someone who does practice this flexible focus, is going to be able to, even if it's just for a little bit, right? Even if it's just temporarily, a 5-minute aside, jump in, start talking about, knife making and, the types of metal you would use and the shapes and how you would hammer it and what type of, what they would be used for, the different types, right? Things of that nature. That is going to make that little kid feel like you actually heard them. And, that's going to help ingrain that experience into their memory for a much longer time, make a much bigger impact, right? That it doesn't just happen with kids either. That could happen with adults, right? You might have, you might be working at a state park doing a educational talk on snakes. Okay. That's one that's pretty common, especially here in Indiana. And maybe you have a person who comes in who is a biology teacher who, maybe studied snakes a little bit in college, right? And so you should be able to pivot and have that sort of dialogue with them, whether that is before or after the sort of main event. You should be able to adjust your focus, be flexible in your focus, and still attain the goals you are looking for while remaining audience centered. As a college professor, I did this all the time as well. I used to do what I called 3-2-1s for attendance, where at the end of every class session, I would have my students write down 3 things that they learned, 2 things that they found interesting about that day's class session, and then a question that they still had, right? Maybe, and then what that did was I was able to look over those questions, and if there were a bunch of students who all had similar questions or questions about the same topic, I would then go back and tweak my next lesson plan to either address unanswered kind of questions that they had, or to maybe throw in a little bit about a certain topic or a subfield that they wanted to learn more about, right? And so what that did was that made every single class, every single semester-long class, a little bit different, and no class got the exact same experience because I was tailoring it to the audience, in that case, the students. But obviously, I didn't shy away from my original goal, which was, okay, today I'm going to talk about, natural world design. Oh, today I'm going to talk about, the chapters in the books that we read that go over visitor studies, right? I'd still stay on topic, but I could tweak the little things. I could change the little details and still achieve my goal while also making it way more audience centered. Something else that I want to really emphasize, and I know I've talked about this book on this podcast before, the book Designing Experiences by Rossman and Durden. Okay, they have this wonderful, wonderful diagram in that book that, has stuck with me to this day. I still think about it whenever I am designing an experience or teaching a class or, teaching about experiences like I'm doing on this podcast, right? And that is the model of the 3 phases of an experience. So they basically say that every single experience has 3 phases. You have the anticipation phase, the participation phase, and then the reflection phase. So obviously, anticipation is everything that happens before the experience actually occurs. So that's, when you are watching YouTube videos of past performances from this artist, when you are, buying the tickets, when you are talking to your travel agent about going to Disney World or Universal, right? That is all the anticipation stage. Then you've got the participation stage, which is basically what it sounds like, right? That is when you are there physically engaged and immersed in whatever experience you are participating in. Then you've got the reflection phase, which is what happens after. That is when a lot of times this is when you would be asked to take a survey about your experience. This is when you are sharing videos on social media. That's when you go to your next family gathering and, really talk about how you had a great time at that theme park or at that show or at that play or at that museum, right? So if you want to remain audience centered, if you want to be design well for your audiences, you have to take all 3 of those into account. There have been so many experiences that I have participated in, both as the designer and as a guest, where the participation phase is the only one that you can tell the designers put any effort into, right? And the anticipation and reflection are kind of an afterthought. So if you want a audience-centered experience, you have to design for all 3 phases. Now, you might not want to design for all 3 phases equally, right? You might want to put, 70% of your effort into the participation and, 15 into the other 2. But that's better than putting 100% into participation and 0 into the other 2, right? Because if you do that, then that also kind of gives you brownie points with your audience, right? Because, okay, you make the experience seamless for them before they actually come to your event or your show or your exhibit. And okay, you're already giving a positive first impression. If you have that uh, good design sense in the reflective phase, that's also going to make the audience feel like you're thinking of them even after you've taken their money, right? Or taken their attention and their time, which gives you a little bit more brownie points, right? So if you want to be audience centered, you gotta focus on all three of those phases. Now, I have talked a lot this episode about understanding what your audience wants and talking to them and getting their feedback. But I haven't really got into well, how do you do that, right? How do you do this visitor studies? Now, anyone who is listening to this who is in, again, the theme park industry, in the museum industry, in the event planning industry, you probably know a lot of this stuff, so it probably would just be a review for you. But in the off chance you don't, I'm just going to kind of throw out some examples of things you can do to better understand your audience and understand their needs and their wants and things of that nature. So obviously, the most used one is the survey, right? Whether that is Qualtrics or whether that is, SurveyMonkey or Google Surveys or whatever they call it nowadays, right? Whatever that program is, right? Where, okay, either before or after your experience, you send participants this survey asking, okay, what are you interested in? What was your favorite part? What do you think could be improved? What could be, what do you think really, really worked, right? Things of that nature. And usually you have both your demographic questions, so things that are going to identify your audience based on these sort of physical is the wrong word, but these sort of observable is the word I'm looking for, observable traits. So things like age, gender, region of the world which they came from, you know, uh, sexual orientation, education level, things that you could, understand just by either looking at them or kind of superficially talking to them. Okay. If they're willing to share it, right? That I will say, always, 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 especially when you're doing demographic questions, make sure you have a option that is prefer not to answer, right? Because there are going to be some people, especially nowadays, that don't want to necessarily share all that information. So always keep that in mind. Again, this is probably a review for a lot of you listening to this, but make sure you do that. Then you've got your psychographic questions, which are going to be more about behavior. So those aren't things that, you are going to understand unless you explicitly ask somebody, right? That is things like, what are their hopes and dreams for the future? What are their opinions on a certain social issue? Stuff about maybe their morals or religious beliefs, right? So yeah, you would have a survey that goes over those two different categories to kind of put them into more recognizable or more clusterable groups. Another method of soliciting feedback that I personally enjoy a lot is a Q&A session, right? And that could be your more kind of standard one that you see at a pop culture convention, right? Where you have famous actors and directors and writers come out and then answer questions from the audience. You could also do that with your board of directors or your design team for a specific exhibit or event, right? But that gives you this sort of direct access to your audience in real time. And by focusing on the questions that are being asked, right, you can probably tease apart some patterns as to what your audience is interested in. Another one that I am a particular fan of are comment cards, mainly because those can be given either during or immediately after that participation phase, right? Because a lot of times surveys don't go out until, a day later, a week later, whatever. so you can kind of get feedback while your audience is still, full of emotion, maybe pumped up on adrenaline, one way or the other, depending on how your experience went. Um, and because it's anonymous, they are going to be more likely to actually be honest. I still will never forget a comment card we got from a seventh grader, or no, I think it was a fifth grader. We did a presentation for fifth graders, and we asked for comment cards, anonymous comment cards, and one of them came back and said, "Total cringe." Yeah, that one still haunts me in my dreams at night. Uh, but I digress. But he was honest, at least, right? And in that case, we understood, okay, maybe the style of presentation we did was not appropriate for the audience we were presenting to. Of course, you can also do more sort of quantitative data, like as simple as attendance numbers or profit, right? Or things like, how many people downloaded your app that goes along with this experience. Or, IKEA has a great feedback system, at least the one here in Fishers, Indiana does, where you basically at the like halfway through the experience between the showroom and the sales floor, you basically you are greeted with these little buttons. Okay. And I think there's a green, a yellow, and a red. And then there's, a smiley face, a neutral face, and then a sad face. Right. And you're supposed to push the button to let IKEA know how your experience went. And then I'm sure it goes to some server somewhere where they tally the data, and it can be like, well, on Wednesday, the 15th, we had a bunch of guests said the experience was very meh. So what did we do wrong that day? Okay, so that sort of thing. You can also, another one that, again, everybody does nowadays, but I would be kind of doing a disservice if I didn't at least mention it, is like social media shares and hashtags, right? If you create something that goes like a TikTok that goes viral and everyone is, jumping on the trend, you could probably say that you need to do more of that, right? That your audience is enjoying it for the most part. Now, there are some exceptions where brands will create an unintentional trend that is maybe a little bit more detrimental to their brand, but that's a discussion for another day. Another thing that I highly, highly recommend, and also you can kind of see the top of my other dog Annie in the background there. She's getting some lunch, so if you're crunching in the background, apologies. But another thing that I always advocate for is put a plant, right? Have somebody who, maybe works for you, and you just kind of send them out there, not in uniform or anything, just kind of being themselves, acting like a normal customer would, and have them observe, right? Have them sort of listen, have them sort of pay attention to, which stations at this trade show got the most traffic, right? Just visually, right? Which exhibit at our museum appeared to get the most smiles from our audience, stuff of that nature. And I don't know enough about this to go into it too in depth, but I am still kind of learning, and I think it's a really cool concept, is this visitor studies technique that is called coded interviews, which from my understanding, and if I'm messing this up, please go to the comments and tell me so I could do better in the future. But from my understanding, that is where you interview somebody, a guest, or you listen to them during their experience, or have them record themselves during their experience, or something like that. And then you compare a bunch of different clips and interviews and conversations, and you look for sort of pattern words in the interviews, right? So they could say, oh, okay, we heard 20 different guests talk about how much they enjoyed the gift shop, or okay, 15 different guests talked about how dirty the bathrooms were, right? And so then you can look at that and say, oh, okay, here's what we're doing well, here's what we're not doing well, based on sort of unsolicited feedback. So, what do you do with all this information that I have given you now today, right? What are your takeaways? What are some kind of action items that you could do to take some of this advice to heart and make a visitor or an audience-centered experience? First and foremost, I'm going to go back to Roy Underhill and the quote that I think every experienced designer, every designer in general, should live by. And that is to know yourself, know your stuff, and know your audience. Okay. So you need to know your own strengths and weaknesses as, as a organization, as a person. What do you do well? What don't you do well? So that you don't, try to do something that you're not very good at on a large scale. You also need to know your stuff, right? You need to actually understand the content or the message or the goals you're trying to convey. And then you need to know your audience. If I could, I would, print that off in the biggest font possible and, hang a banner from the highway so that everyone could see it, right? Because that's how much I believe in that quote. So obviously, knowing yourself, that's easy. You just got to be introspective and reflective. Knowing your stuff, you do content research. Knowing your audience, that is where you do visitor studies, right? That is where the previous sort of bullet points come in handy, where you're soliciting feedback, you're looking at surveys, you're looking at coded interviews, things of that nature. So yeah, if you want to know your audience to make an audience-centered experience, you got to do visitor studies. Also, stealing a little bit from the anthropology world, you should also do some sort of ethnographic research, right? So ethnography is, in simplified layman's terms, is essentially when is research done by a cultural group by an outside observer, right? And so, you probably have heard about that, of like the National Geographic specials where an American goes to, the Congo and, just observes and documents research on the people that live there, right? Even I would even argue the Conan O'Brien Must Go TV show that I think I've talked about before on this podcast. That is technically, probably I would get some pushback on this, but that is an ethnographic research that is ethnographic research that he is doing in that show, right? He's this goofy American comedian who is going around the world just completely out of place and making observations about different cultures, right? So you can do that with different demographic groups, and I would argue it is pretty essential. So the last thing that I kind of want to talk about with this episode, my kind of parting words, is I just want to re-emphasize why it is so important to be audience-centered, especially nowadays in this experience economy that we are living in, right? It is integral that you understand your audience, that you know their needs, their wants, what they expect, both from your genre of experience and your brand in general. And the reason I say that is because now with the internet and social media and people's ability to travel around the country and around the world, in a matter of hours or days, given modern transportation systems and the infrastructure we have. If you are not meeting your audience's needs and wants, somebody else is. So you better identify your audience, you better understand what they want, and as Walt Disney would say, you better give the people what they want. Without a loyal audience, you don't exist, right? My podcast would not exist if I didn't have the audience that I do, which granted it's still growing, but it's a fairly small audience. But if I got 0 views on my episodes and my videos, that I would stop doing this, right? Likewise, if a museum has a super record low attendance, they're probably not going to be in business much longer. If your product doesn't have this sort of hardcore audience of followers and influencers and super fans, it's probably also not going to last very long, right? Without your audience, you don't exist. And so, like any good relationship, make sure you keep them happy, and they will often return the favor. I'm Austin Baker of Baker's Dozens Productions, and I will see you on the next episode of Exploring Experiences.